Poor African woman was washing dishes and singing with a knife. Unaware the Arab executive was watching. She had no idea her life was about to change forever. In the back of a small, dimly lit restaurant, Amina scrubbed the same old cracked plates she had washed every day for the last 5 years. Her hands were rough, her apron worn thin, but her voice was something no one ever paid attention to. As she worked, she sang softly, an old song from her childhood, using a simple kitchen knife as a pretend microphone, letting her heart escape through melodies no one seemed to hear. But hidden just beyond the swinging doors, unseen and silent, stood Khalil al-Masri, the most powerful Arab executive in the region. He wasn't supposed to be there. Yet something about that raw, unpolished voice made him stop in his tracks. And in that quiet moment, as the sound of her voice floated through the air, Khalil knew he had just found something money could never buy. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. What happens next will leave you speechless and inspire you to believe that even in the darkest places, incredible miracles can be found. Amina never imagined anyone important would ever notice her. To the world, she was just the invisible girl who scrubbed dishes until her fingers bled, her dreams tucked away beneath piles of dirty plates and the constant stench of old cooking oil. But even in that harsh reality, she had one thing no one could take from her: her voice. It was late, the restaurant nearly empty after a slow, rainy evening. The last customers had left hours ago, and while the other staff rushed out to catch the final bus home, Amina remained behind, lost in her own little world. She didn't mind. In fact, she preferred these quiet hours when no one was around to judge or interrupt her escape. With a battered old knife in one hand and a sponge in the other, she swayed gently to a rhythm only she could hear. Her voice rose above the sound of running water, carrying a soft melody from her childhood. It was a song her mother used to hum under the stars, back when life was simpler and hope still felt within reach. What Amina didn't know was that on the other side of the kitchen's swinging doors, someone had stopped to listen. Khalil al-Masri wasn't just any man. He was the CEO of Al-Masri Holdings, one of the most influential conglomerates in the Middle East, a man whose signature could move markets and whose presence made boardrooms fall silent. That night, a rare twist of fate had brought him to this small, humble restaurant, not for the cuisine, but to meet an old college friend who owned the struggling business. But as the meeting ended and his friend stepped away to make a call, Khalil wandered through the back halls, distracted by the faint sound of a voice unlike anything he'd ever heard. He stood still, his tailored shoes silent against the cold tile floor, his eyes fixed on the narrow crack between the swinging kitchen doors. And there she was, a young woman, her skin glowing under the flickering fluorescent lights, moving gracefully despite the exhaustion visible in her slumped shoulders. She sang like no one was listening, her voice raw and full of emotion that seemed too big for such a small space. The knife in her hand became her microphone, and for a moment she wasn't a forgotten dishwasher in a crumbling kitchen. She was a star, singing to a crowd of thousands in a grand concert hall. Khalil's chest tightened. There was something hauntingly beautiful about the way she poured her soul into every note. It wasn't trained or polished, but it was real, authentic. And then she turned. Their eyes met through the thin crack in the door. Amina's smile faded instantly, her face flushing with embarrassment. She hadn't realized anyone had been listening, especially not a man in a perfectly tailored suit who looked like he belonged to a different world entirely. She quickly dropped the knife, fumbling with the sponge, her hands shaking as she turned her back to him. But Khalil didn't move. "Don't stop," he said gently, his deep voice cutting through the awkward silence. Amina froze. Slowly, she turned her head back toward the door, her wide eyes meeting his again. "Please," he added, his expression softening. "Your voice, it's extraordinary." She swallowed hard, her heart pounding painfully against her ribs. No one had ever said those words to her before. In fact, most people barely even noticed she existed. I'm sorry, sir," she stammered, her voice small and uncertain. "I didn't mean to disturb anyone." "You didn't," Khalil said, stepping closer. "You reminded me what beauty sounds like when it's untouched by fame or fortune." For a long, breathless moment, neither of them spoke. And then, quietly, Amina began to hum again. Just a soft melody at first, her voice trembling like a candle in the wind. But Khalil stood there and listened as if it were the most important performance he'd ever attended. And in that small kitchen, with nothing but soap bubbles and broken dreams between them, something shifted. Neither of them knew it yet, but that night marked the beginning of a journey neither could have imagined. A journey that would test their courage, shatter their fears, and prove that sometimes the most extraordinary people are hidden in the most unexpected places. Amina couldn't sleep that night. Long after she had hung up her stained apron and slipped out into the rain-soaked streets, her mind kept replaying every second of that strange encounter. Why had he stopped to listen? People like him didn't belong in her world. She had spent her entire life unseen, her dreams buried under the weight of survival. And yet, for a brief moment in that cramped kitchen, she'd felt truly seen by a man who looked like he could buy the entire restaurant just to have it torn down. The next day, she returned to work, convinced it had all meant nothing. Just a passing moment. Someone like Khalil al-Masri had probably already forgotten she existed. But she was wrong. It was nearly noon when the door to the kitchen swung open and her manager, Omar, entered with wide eyes and a face pale with disbelief. "Amina," he gasped. "Come, now. Someone's asking for you." Her heart nearly stopped. I'm not supposed to leave the kitchen," she stammered, wiping her wet hands on her apron. "It's Mr. Al-Masri," Omar whispered, his voice trembling with awe. "The Khalil Al-Masri. He's asking for you by name." Amina's legs barely supported her as she stepped out into the main dining room. And there he was, seated alone at a table near the window, dressed impeccably in a dark gray suit that probably cost more than she made in a year. When he saw her, he rose to his feet, his gaze warm but focused. "Miss Amina," he greeted, his deep voice as smooth and commanding as she remembered. "Thank you for joining me." She stood awkwardly at the edge of the table, her hands twisting the hem of her apron. I'm sorry, sir. I don't understand why I'm here." He gestured to the chair across from him. "Please, sit." Her heart pounded as she sat, her mind racing through every possible explanation. And then, without preamble, he said the words that left her speechless. "I want to offer you an opportunity," Khalil began, his eyes locked on hers. "Your voice, it's a rare gift, raw, untrained, but more honest than anything I've heard in years. I believe it deserves to be heard by the world." Amina blinked, struggling to find her voice. I'm sorry, Mr. Al-Masri, but I think you must be mistaken. I'm just—" "Don't say you're just a dishwasher," he interrupted gently. "What I heard last night was the sound of someone who has lived, who has suffered, and who still dares to dream. That kind of voice can change lives, Miss Amina. But you need someone to help you find that stage." She swallowed hard, her eyes burning with tears she refused to shed. "I can't afford lessons," she whispered. "I barely make enough to eat." His lips curved into a faint smile. "I'm not asking you to pay for anything. I'm offering to sponsor you, fully. Vocal coaching, proper training, everything you need to unlock the potential that's already inside you." She stared at him, stunned. This couldn't be real. Things like this didn't happen to people like her. "Why?" she finally asked, her voice shaking. "Why would you do this for me?" For a moment, something unspoken passed through his eyes, a hint of his own hidden battles, his own secrets buried beneath a life of privilege and expectation. "Let's just say," he said softly, "I know what it feels like to live trapped by circumstances beyond your control. And sometimes, all it takes is one person willing to open the door." Amina's vision blurred as the tears she'd tried to hold back spilled free. She covered her face with her hands, overwhelmed by the impossible kindness of a man who, by every measure, owed her nothing. He reached across the table, his fingers gently brushing against hers. "This isn't charity, Amina," he said quietly. "This is belief. And sometimes that's all we need to start rewriting our story." And in that moment, she knew her life would never be the same. By the end of that week, Amina stood in front of a building she never imagined she'd enter. A prestigious music academy perched high on a hill overlooking the city. Its stone facade gleamed under the midday sun. Large arched windows casting elegant patterns of light onto the marble floors inside. She stared up at it, her heart pounding hard enough to drown out every logical thought. "This isn't my place," she thought. "I don't belong here." But then she felt it, that familiar warmth of belief, the memory of Khalil's words echoing in her mind. "This isn't charity, Amina. This is belief." And as if on cue, his voice called out from behind her. "Doubt doesn't look good on you," Khalil said, with that faint, knowing smile. Amina turned to find him walking toward her, his dark, tailored suit crisp against the bright sky. He moved with that effortless confidence she'd only seen in men who knew exactly what doors the world would open for them. Yet, despite the commanding presence he carried, his eyes held nothing but quiet reassurance. "I feel like I'm about to walk into another universe," she confessed, her hands clutching the straps of her old canvas bag. "You are," he replied simply. "But that doesn't mean you don't belong in it." She followed him inside, every step feeling heavier than the last. The polished floors reflected her hesitant footsteps, and everywhere she turned, she saw people who looked like they had spent their whole lives preparing for this. Elegant women in designer dresses, young men in expensive shoes, carrying finely crafted instruments. And then there was her. Amina, the girl from the kitchen, wearing the only clean blouse she owned, and shoes that had long since given up on keeping out the rain. As if reading her thoughts, Khalil leaned down slightly and said, "None of that matters here. What matters is when you open your mouth and let them hear what I heard." They approached a woman standing near the entrance to the main practice hall, clipboard in hand, sharp eyes taking in everything. "Miss Amina Diarra," Khalil introduced her formally. "She's here for her first private evaluation." The woman raised an eyebrow but nodded, leading them through tall double doors into a grand open studio. "Take a moment," the woman instructed before stepping aside. Amina stood in the center of the room, the space feeling impossibly large and silent. Her fingers trembled as she brought her hands together, unsure of where to begin. Khalil stood by the door, his arms crossed, his eyes never leaving her. "Whenever you're ready," he said softly, his voice the only steady thing she could hold on to. And somehow, that was all she needed. Amina closed her eyes. She thought of home, of the warm nights under open skies, of her mother's voice floating through the air as they sat by the fire. And slowly, her lips parted, and she began to sing. At first, her voice was timid, unsure, the notes soft as a whisper. But as the memories came flooding back, the words poured out stronger, fuller, each note carrying years of hidden pain and quiet hope. The song wasn't in English or Arabic. It was a lullaby from her village, a language almost forgotten by the world. Yet it didn't matter. Music, after all, had no borders. By the time she finished, the room felt different, charged with a quiet reverence. She opened her eyes, tears blurring her vision, and looked to Khalil. His expression wasn't the proud, victorious look she expected. Instead, his eyes glistened with something deeper, something personal. "That's the voice I heard that night," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And it's the voice the world needs to hear." Before she could respond, the woman with the clipboard approached. Her stern expression softened just slightly. "We'll arrange her schedule," she told Khalil directly. "Miss Diarra has something rare, something real." For the first time, Amina felt it too. Maybe she really did belong here. And as she left the academy that afternoon, the city below her feet felt less like a towering mountain and more like a horizon waiting to be reached. The following weeks passed like a dream Amina couldn't quite believe she was living. Every day, she walked through the grand arched doors of the music academy, her old canvas bag replaced by a simple but elegant leather satchel. An unexpected gift from Khalil on her first official day. At first, she felt like a stranger in every room. The other students had years of formal training, spoke of composers she had never heard of, and carried their polished voices like weapons of pride. Amina's voice wasn't like theirs, refined or technical, but it was raw, and it carried the weight of her experiences in every trembling note. And that, as her new vocal coach Madame Caron often reminded her, was something no amount of technical perfection could ever replace. But with every step forward, new doubts crept in. Late one evening, after a grueling session that left her throat sore and her confidence shaken, Amina found herself standing alone on the academy's rooftop terrace. The city stretched out endlessly below her, lights flickering like stars scattered across the earth. She didn't hear him approach, but somehow she knew it was Khalil before he even spoke. "Why do you always come up here when you're struggling?" he asked gently, standing beside her with his hands in his coat pockets. She kept her eyes on the horizon. "Because up here, the city feels small, and my problem's even smaller," she admitted. "Down there, everything feels too big, like I'm pretending to be someone I'm not." He was quiet for a moment before speaking. "You know, I used to do the same thing," he said. "After my father died, and I was suddenly expected to take over a billion-dollar empire I didn't even believe in. I'd stand on rooftops like this and wonder if I was strong enough to survive a world that seemed determined to swallow me whole." That made her turn to him. For all his wealth and power, she had never seen this version of Khalil before. Vulnerable, his shoulders heavy with memories he rarely spoke about. "And did you?" she asked softly. He smiled faintly. "I'm still here, aren't I?" For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The cool night air swirled between them, filled with words neither of them could say aloud. "Khalil," she began cautiously, "why are you really doing this for me? You could have chosen anyone. Why me?" He turned his head, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Because you remind me of who I used to be. Someone standing on the edge of a life they're too scared to step into. And because I never had anyone to believe in me when I needed it most. His words settled deep in her chest, warm and painful all at once. Before she could reply, a gust of wind swept across the rooftop, and without thinking, Khalil reached out, his hand brushing a loose strand of hair from her face. His fingers lingered longer than they should have, his eyes searching hers for something unspoken. I believe in you, Amina, he said, his voice low and certain, even when you don't believe in yourself. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to pause, but then the academy bells chimed in the distance, snapping them both back into the reality they weren't sure how to navigate. Khalil stepped back, his expression carefully composed once again. You have a recital coming up, he reminded her softly. I'll be in the front row. And with that, he turned and disappeared down the stairwell, leaving Amina standing in the cool night air, her heart pounding against the weight of a new world she wasn't sure she was ready to embrace. But as she looked out at the city again, something inside her shifted. Maybe believing in herself wouldn't start with grand victories. Maybe it started right here, with a single deep breath and the courage to keep going. The night of the recital arrived faster than Amina expected. As she stood backstage, the weight of her new life pressed hard against her chest. Her palms were damp despite the cool air of the auditorium, and every breath felt like it barely reached her lungs. Through the thick velvet curtains, she could hear the polite murmur of the audience. Distinguished guests from across the city had filled the seats, business elites, cultural patrons, and members of the Academy's board. And somewhere among them was Khalil. She closed her eyes and tried to focus, repeating the words Madame Caron had drilled into her. Sing your truth, Amina. Not for them, for you. But it was hard to believe that in this grand hall, surrounded by people who had lived in privilege their whole lives, her truth would matter. A soft voice broke through her spiraling thoughts. You're ready, Amina. She turned to find Madame Caron standing behind her, elegant as ever in a flowing silk gown. Her sharp blue eyes softened for the first time in weeks of strict training. You've already done the hardest part, the older woman continued. You survived. Now, let them hear how it sounds to overcome the impossible. Amina swallowed hard and nodded. The stage manager motioned, and suddenly the curtains began to part. A hush fell over the audience as she stepped into the spotlight. For a heartbeat, she froze. The hall felt endless, faces blurry under the blinding lights. But then her eyes found him, Khalil, sitting in the front row, his expression calm, but his eyes shining with something deeper. Pride. And just like that, the world narrowed to this moment. Amina drew a shaky breath and began to sing. The first few notes came out soft and uncertain, her voice trembling just as much as her hands. But as the melody grew, so did her confidence. She wasn't just singing the notes she had practiced. She was pouring out every piece of herself she had locked away for years. Pain, hope, loss, dreams she had almost forgotten. Each note soared higher than the last, filling the grand hall with a voice that had never been meant to stay hidden. And when she reached the final verse, her mother's lullaby, the same song she'd once hummed in the kitchen with nothing but a battered knife for a microphone, the entire audience fell into a silence so profound it felt like the world had stopped breathing. As her voice faded into the last trembling note, Amina stood in that silence, her chest rising and falling, her hands clenched at her sides. And then, applause, not just polite clapping, but a wave of it, genuine, thunderous applause that rose from the back rows to the front until the whole room stood on its feet. Her eyes locked on Khalil once more, and she saw him standing too, his hands coming together slowly, but with a smile so genuine it made her vision blur with tears. In that moment, she understood what he meant weeks ago. This isn't charity. This is belief. She had earned this. Backstage, as the curtains closed and she collapsed onto the nearest chair, her heart still pounding with adrenaline, she felt a familiar presence beside her. "Congratulations," Khalil said quietly, crouching down to her level. Before she could stop herself, she threw her arms around him, holding him tight as the tears finally spilled over. "I was so scared," she whispered against his shoulder. "I know," he murmured back. "But you did it anyway. That's real courage, Amina." When she finally pulled away, their faces were close, too close. For a second, neither of them moved. The weight of the moment, the tension that had been growing between them for weeks, hung in the air like a fragile thread stretched to its limit. But then, just as his hand lifted to gently brush a tear from her cheek, the sound of approaching footsteps broke the spell. Khalil stood quickly, his expression shifting back to calm composure. "I should go," he said softly. "But remember, this was only the beginning." And before she could find the words to stop him, he disappeared once more into the shadows of the grand hall, leaving her with a heart full of gratitude and a longing she could no longer deny. The days after the recital passed in a daze. Everywhere Amina went, people seemed to know her name. Strangers stopped her in the academy corridors. Instructors she had never spoken to before offered their congratulations, and offers for more performances began to pour in. But the one person she most wanted to hear from had vanished. Khalil al-Masri. Since the night of the recital, he hadn't called, hadn't visited the academy. His absence echoed louder than his words that night. This is only the beginning. But if that was true, why did it feel so much like the end? She told herself it was foolish to expect anything more. Khalil was a man from a different world, a life of luxury, power, and responsibilities she could barely imagine. And she was still, at her core, the girl who had scrubbed dishes in the back of a forgotten restaurant. Yet no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't forget the way his arms had felt around her, the quiet reassurance in his voice when she thought she couldn't go on. One rainy afternoon, unable to stand the uncertainty any longer, she made her way to the Al-Masri corporate headquarters. The towering glass building stood like a monument to everything she'd never known. Polished marble floors reflected the cold, modern lines of the lobby. Security guards eyed her suspiciously as she approached the reception desk. I'm looking for Mr. Al-Masri, she said softly, her voice barely audible above the distant echoes of the busy office space. The receptionist offered a tight, professional smile. I'm sorry, miss. Mr. Al-Masri is currently abroad on business. He's not expected back for several weeks. Amina felt the words like a punch to the chest. Abroad? He left without saying goodbye? She thanked the receptionist and left quickly, stepping back into the grey drizzle that had settled over the city. The rain masked the tears that slipped down her cheeks as she stood on the crowded sidewalk, her heart heavier than it had been in months. Maybe it really is over, but life, as it always had, refused to let her fall apart. 2 weeks later, she received a formal letter from the academy. Her performance at the recital had captured the attention of the World Music Conservatory in Paris. They were offering her a full scholarship, an opportunity to train among the world's finest vocalists. It was everything she'd ever dreamed of, a chance to leave behind the life of hardship and stand on global stages. But one thing held her back. The man who had made her believe she deserved this in the first place was gone. That night, standing once again on the rooftop of the academy, she held the letter in her hands and let the wind threaten to tear it from her fingers. And then, "Don't you dare let that go," a familiar voice said from behind her. Her heart stopped. She spun around, and there he was, Khalil, standing in the rain without an umbrella, his suit soaked through, his expression raw and unguarded. "You disappeared," she said, her voice cracking with all the emotion she'd bottled up. "You left without a word." "I had to," he admitted, stepping closer. "I needed time to figure out how to be the man you deserve, not the man trapped by the expectations of his world." She shook her head, the tears finally breaking free. "You think I care about any of that?" "I care," he said quietly. "I care because for the first time in my life, I want something that isn't measured by wealth or status. I want you, Amina." And I was terrified I wasn't enough. Before she could answer, his hands were on her face, his lips capturing hers with all the intensity of a man who had spent every waking moment regretting his absence. The rain poured harder, but neither of them noticed. When they finally pulled apart, his forehead rested against hers, his breath warm against her lips. "Go to Paris," he whispered. "Live your dream." And when you're ready, come find me. I'll be waiting." Amina smiled through her tears. "I think you're forgetting something, Khalil," she said softly. "What's that?" She pressed her lips to his again, slow and full of promise. "The dreams don't have to wait. Sometimes they're standing right in front of you." And in that moment, Amina knew she could have both, her dream and the man who believed in it first. The final applause faded, but Amina's heart still thundered. In the shadows backstage, Khalil waited. Without a word, she ran into his arms. "You kept your promise," she whispered. He smiled, brushing a tear from her cheek. "And now I'm asking you to keep one for me." She pulled back, searching his eyes. "Stay with me, Amina. Wherever life takes us, just stay." She nodded through her tears, her heart finally at peace. Weeks later, under a sky painted with 1,000 stars, Khalil took Amina's hand as they stood on a quiet beach in Dubai. "I've built empires, Amina," he said softly, "but nothing compares to building a life with you." With a simple gold ring and a kiss full of promises, their new life began. Without fear, without walls, just love. On the biggest stage of her career, Amina sang with Khalil sitting proudly in the front row. Her voice soared, a living testament to resilience, love, and the man who believed when no one else did. And as the curtain fell, he rose, meeting her backstage with just 3 words. "Let's go home." Hand in hand, they walked toward a future neither of them could have imagined. But both knew they were finally home.